Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Dave. I'm a parent of a daughter in college, and we live in Chicago, Illinois.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University.
This week in the news, a great article from my favorite bourgeois magazine, Town and Country, and it is called Southern Exposure by Nicole Laporte. Our question from a listener is the final segment on the question, why do colleges admit students with lower grades and test scores over kids with higher grades and test scores? Our interview is, how does athletic recruitment work at a D3 school? An interview with Justin Doty, the Dean of Admissions at Trinity University, and Paul McGinlay, the athletic liaison at Trinity, part 2 of 4. And our college spotlight is one I will be listening to. It is by Kevin Newton, who is going to talk about the 5 universities that were founded and arrived from ancient Scotland.
And it's great to have Dave back in the saddle, man. And Lauren's back home. I got to do a little quick Zoom with Lauren, his daughter. It's like old times.
It is wonderful. Yes. And you know what? Mark, we've been struggling to get good audio quality on my computer.
Yes.
And then I come with my daughter's brand new MacBook 55, 57, whatever. And then she tells me, Dad, your computer you're using is over 10 years old.
and our listeners are not surprised because our regular listeners know that I deemed you Dr. Lincoln Penny because you're so tight. You try to push Lincoln off the penny. And for those of you who don't know that goes back to when we traveled as a family. Yeah. And my father gave us all lunch allowances, and Dave would just go for water, pocket the money, and then mooch off of us and try to hit us up for our fries. So he got labeled, and he's stuck, and the label has stuck. This is a guy who's spent over $10,000 on a car like once in his life.
Hey, folks, I'm talking to Dr. Lincoln Nickel here because then he says, I got a great deal at Best Buy, Acer computer for $373.
Well, it's not my main computer. It's a backup.
Still. Hey, look, when Dr. Lincoln Penny wants to find a deal, he looks at his buddy, Dr. Lincoln Nickel over here. He'll figure it out for me.
Awesome. Well, we have an exciting article to discuss today. Normally, I just pick articles for Dave and I sign them, but this was one he handpicked out, and he said, I want to talk about it. But before we get to that, of course, to start out with our traditionals. So start out with our admissions tip. And I'm going to pack a lot in here. It has to do with the activity list. So we all know the activity list, and I'll just focus on the Common App right now because that's the most popular application out there, but pretty much most applications have an activity list. And I will tell you that the activity list does end up being one of the more important parts of the application. I know it from my own experience at admission. I know it when I sit in and I'm invited to sit in admissions rooms at various schools around the country. It gets a lot of talk, a lot of conversation for a couple of reasons. One, when you open a file, you're trying to get to know who the person is. And one of the best ways to get to know who that person is let me look what you did when you had free time. It's a great insight into who you are as a person. The second thing is you're trying to get some semblance of where that person may have impact on your campus. And while there's no guarantee, if they are actively involved in student government, that's where they'll hang their hat on your campus. It's the best predictor you have to go on. So this is a place that's worth putting time in. And so what I'm going to do, I'm giving this long admissions tip, but it's that time of year where we can still get stuff in. This is like the last episode that goes live before November 1. So I'm going to share a sample of a really, really well-written activity list. And I wish I could claim credit for this, but we all beg, borrow, and steal out here, Dave. I took this from another admission officer, and I liked it, so I use it to share with all my students. And it simply says this. This was a description of what they did. Listen to this description. Created and implemented first school-wide daily e-newsletter solely solicited over 1K in e-newsletter ads with profits deposited into the prom fund. 7 reasons why I love this description. 1, active verbs, created and implemented. 2, used bullet points, didn't feel they needed to keep saying I did this, I did that, and write in full sentences so they're able to get more in. 3, not afraid to brag. This is one place where you can brag. You're supposed to toot your horn a little bit. Not afraid to say first school-wide e-newsletter. 4th, detailed description. I know what you actually did. So many of them are so vague, but I actually know what you did. I didn't just say newsletter, e-newsletter, detailed description. 5, use of numbers. Specific benchmarks so that I can see your impact and what you actually did. 1,000 in e-newsletter. 6, the purpose was in there. This was all for the prom fund. 7, did not repeat everything in the title. So that's a lot in there. 7 tips today, Dave, but all one, how to write a really good detailed description for your activities list. All right. Next, any thoughts on that one?
I think that's excellent. There are more points that description made than there were words in the description. That's actually pretty impressive. 7 points out of 30 words. That was really great. But the key with that is many times, Mark, how many words are they giving you? Like 30, 40, 50?
No, 30. No, you're 150 characters,
right?
Which is the average word is 5 characters a word. So it's basically 30 words. So you picked the right number there. Right. You basically got 30 words. So you got to be efficient. That's
right. And I think the key with the bullet points and being specific and not repeating yourself and putting in data points is all, they hit it out the park with that one.
Awesome. Good stuff. Admissions vernacular, LEP. What does LEP stand for? Limited Enrollment Program. It's a term you'll see some schools use. I was working with a student last week, and one of her favorite schools is Maryland. And one of her majors she wants to major in is psychology. And so we had to have a conversation. I said, psychology is one of 11 LEPs, or Limited Enrollment Programs, at Maryland. What does that mean? These are programs that they have specific gateway requirements for admission to determine enrollment because space is so tight. Another way of saying it is this is a very oversubscribed competitive major that because it's so competitive, they have put some special parameters in order to get in because of supply and demand, basic principles of supply and demand. In some ways, there's some similarities to what we've talked to before about an impacted major, which is a term that the UCs use, but it's not exactly the same. There are differences. Dave, I got to have you guess at something.
Yes.
Want to take a guess at what the LEPs would be for Maryland?
Oh, jeez.
Limited education programs or more competitive majors?
Okay. Got to be engineering.
All right, so I'm going to tell you what they are, and we'll see. You got to give me more than one guess, man.
Oh, okay. Limited education. So these are majors that people want to get into, but are limited due to space. Correct.
Correct.
All right. So I know a lot of people want to get into engineering. A lot of people want to get into computer science. A lot of people want to get.
So far, you're 2 for 2.
And then finance business.
All right, so listen to this. This is pretty good. See, I gave you a layup, man.
Yes,
when you're only on here once a month, I feel like I become softy over here. All right, number 1. Now, this is just Maryland, but it would not be atypical, right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes schools do have their special programs at their school. So here's Maryland's list. Business.
Yeah. Well,
biology.
Yeah.
Business, biology, biochemistry.
Yeah.
Chemistry.
Yeah.
Communication. They have a very strong communication school. Computer science, which you already mentioned, criminology and criminal justice, engineering, which you already mentioned, environmental science, which when schools have very strong environmental science programs, another one is UVM, that actually tends to be a really hot major. Same for UMass Amherst. Okay, immersive media design in the computing track, and then immersive media design in the creative track. And then the last 2, neuroscience and psychology.
Yeah.
So basically, I think you went 4 for 4 on that one, my friend.
Yeah. Feeders to the high
paying jobs.
High paid jobs. That's right.
You may be Dr. Lincoln Penny, but there's still penny in there. There's still money. You know how to see Benjamins. Nobody ever
That's right.
accused you of that. All right. Our big number is 52,000 and 52,000. Where did that come from? Well, I spent almost an entire day at Georgia State University on Tuesday for a counselor program. About 20 of us were in there for that. It was fantastic. Met all their senior leaders. And when I'm walking up with them, we got to chit-chatting, mission officers touring me and, or just chit-chatting with me, and she's walking me into the room. And she's like, man, our numbers are great this year. Get in there. First thing, 52,000 students is how many students Georgia State has now, the largest school in the state of Georgia. And I picked that because it's a really good segue into our topic du jour. Take it away, Dave.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
Wonderful. Well, I don't know if all of you folks listen to Town and Country, but Town and Country is one of those magazines that always have the real pretty people on. Pretty people, pretty cars, pretty lives. And so it's very interesting that this article focuses on a new trend among well-to-do, wealthy Northeastern students who are considering something other than the Ivies. It starts off talking about a young man, Brennan Vincent, who was a Brennan Vincent, junior at Maroneck High School. It was described as a, quote, groaningly wealthy suburb of New York. And she was in a top-ranked school where everyone's competitive and everyone's trying to get into the same type of Ivy League schools. And this young lady felt the process was so untoward, competitive, and crazy that it was affecting both her and her friends' mental health, and she was very much turned off. So when her father, who actually went to Auburn, a school in eastern Alabama, suggested, hey, why don't you consider my alma mater? She did. And it describes that within seconds of setting foot on this beautiful, lush, rolling campus, she was smitten. She said, out of all the campuses I toured, it was easily the most beautiful. It was warm. There were people playing Frisbee, having picnics. Everybody just seemed so happy. And as a result, she enrolled the following year in Auburn's Honors College, and she's just loving it. And what this article pointed out is that this young lady is part of a growing trend among high school students in liberal hubs like New York, Boston, Los Angeles, and Chicago, who are deciding to forego the competitive, cutthroat environments of places like Colgate and Columbia for the more rah-rah vibe with places like Auburn, Southern Methodist University, Texas Christian University, Clemson, and the University of Miami. Schools that have been traditionally written off by coastal snobs as football and frat schools that let anyone with a measurable GPA in their doors. Now, there's always consisted a group of schools that have been known as, quote unquote, the Southern Ivies. These are schools like Tulane and Emory in Atlanta, which is often compared to Williams College, and Vanderbilt, which is often considered the Harvard of the South. And of course, North Carolina, which has its two powerhouses, both UNC Chapel Hill and Duke. However, there's a group of Southern universities that was previously considered, quote unquote, second tier that are now becoming increasingly competitive and sought after. These are schools such as Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas, where now 57% of its incoming class is out-of-staters. It also includes schools like Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, where 62% of this year's incoming class are out of state. It also includes places like the Honors College at University of South Carolina, where it talks about one young lady turned down an Ivy acceptance to attend there and is very happy. So the question is, why are these Southern colleges suddenly becoming so popular? Well, the article hits on about four major points. The first one is, number one, because the traditional Northeast Ivy type schools are so incredibly selective and competitive. Harvard had an acceptance rate of 5% in 2021. The University of Southern California, which used to be dubbed the University of Spoiled Children, has an acceptance rate of 16%. However, the schools like SMU and Texas Christian have now created a sweet spot where they're not crazy competitive to get into, but they're competitive enough that students feel like they're getting a really good value of a school in a really sought after environment. As one college counselor said, quote, these schools hit the sweet spot of being easier to get into than the Ivies, but not easy. According to this college counselor, quote, I think anything with that 45% acceptance rate or higher, but not 80%, makes students feel, okay, I'm going to a really good school that I can maybe get into. The second reason is that, quite frankly, most of these Southern schools were far better places to be in the last couple of years due to COVID. In the Northeast, where many schools had strict COVID protocols, almost all online instruction, and many of their extracurriculars totally torpedoed by COVID, many of these schools had a much more relaxed atmosphere. They had on-campus instruction, and the kids still had a semblance of social life. The third reason was that many of these schools are perceived to be just more fun places to be. Some of them are Division I athletic schools. A lot of them have a much more exciting and relaxed campus vibe, where the frat scene and the party scene is considered to be a lot more lively than the traditional Northeast schools. And the fourth major reason was the culture wars. This article profiled many conservative families that felt that the Northeast schools were too, quote unquote, woke, and that they didn't want these woke institutions brainwashing kids with woke ideologies. So they liked it when they went to Southern schools that tended to be a little bit more on the red side politically, and where they didn't feel that they had to ascribe to what they described as a, quote, cancel culture. Now, there are cons to these schools. As you can imagine, if you're going to a place that's less woke and you're a diehard liberal, you might be ending up in zombie land, where you might find yourself the only Democrat in a study group of Republicans. Also, for many minority students, they found that if you were a person of color or a person of a particular religious persuasion, you might find that you might not have as much cultural diversity as you would like. But the article pointed out that many of these schools are now in burgeoning, increasingly diverse urban environments. Schools like Emory is in Atlanta, home to major corporations and a growing diverse population. SMU is in Dallas, another major population that is bursting in demographic size and variety. Austin is, of course, UT Austin is in Austin, a surprisingly liberal place for Texas, and the University of Miami is in Miami. So even if you feel that many of the Southern schools are not quite as politically correct or diverse as you might like, there are a lot of Southern schools in very diverse cultural and political environments. So I'm going to stop here, Mark, and just say that for me, I found what was great about this article is finally people are starting to think outside the box and realize that there's no such thing as just the top 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 type of schools to go to, that regardless of your proclivities or inclinations, you as an individual actually have hundreds of great choices of schools to attend. And the fact that the Southern schools are getting so much play makes sense. And I just want to point out one last thing. I often tease Mark as being a weather weenie, but in Chicago, when the first time that hawk blows and it's 20 degrees, I do sort of think maybe I might hop in and join you in your hot tub in Atlanta. But folks, don't tell him that.
Great summary as always, my friend. And first of all, I have to give a shout out to Vince, because Vince sent me this article and he's like, man, I want to discuss this. And the problem is Vincent has already recorded his November episode already. And so I didn't want to wait till December. So I'm like, Vince, man, I got to go with this one. This is going to be our last one in October. And he willingly obliged and willing to give up the one he wanted to talk about. So thanks to Vince for both being selfless and for discovering it and sending it our way. And since then, many other people, listeners, sent it our way. So really, really good article about a really important topic that we haven't had a chance to talk about. And I feel like I have a very good vantage point on this one, Dave, because I've worked, one, I live in the South, but two, I have worked with a lot of students from different parts of the country that have explicitly chosen Southern schools. And there's no doubt that Southern schools are hot and they're popping and they just touched the surface of examples. I'll mention three others they never even mentioned in the article. Florida State. Yeah. So Florida State last year absolutely blew up. One of the highest surges in applications. I think it did have the highest surge, actually, of all schools in the country, in terms of like more applications than the year before.
They were up 78% in applications.
And the interesting thing about it, Dave, is that Florida was literally the only state in the country that required test scores in 2020 and 2021.
Right.
So you hear all the talk of the burgeoning applications because people don't have test scores. The entire state, and keep in mind when you're dealing with public institutions, these decisions are made at the Board of Regent, Board of Governors level. Like oftentimes the colleges themselves would have loved to have not had to take test scores, but they didn't get to make the call. I'm talking about the public schools. I'm not talking about the private schools like Rollins and Miami and schools like that. I'm talking about the public schools. Those private ones, they all went test optional.
Yeah.
So even in a climate where they required test scores still, and there's some reasons for that. Florida's got a program called Bright Futures, which links test scores to merit scholarship money, and so their whole system has been kind of based on, offering a merit scholarship that has test scores as a component, and so they don't want to just drastically overturn the whole system. And they still had ridiculous growth. And then I'm right here in Georgia, so I can't help but give Georgia examples. And I really think that the article is remiss in not having some of these examples. And I asked myself, like, how could they miss Florida State, Georgia Tech, even Georgia State? But I'll just stick to Georgia Tech, and Florida State. And then I really think it has to do with the fact that I looked up the average income of their readers, and it's over $300,000.
Yeah.
So they're very much focused on their private schools. Now, they did correctly point out Auburn. That's another place having a lot of growth. Auburn blew up last year, too, and South Carolina is blowing up, and Clemson. So in fairness, they didn't completely avoid public schools. Clemson, South Carolina, and Auburn are all absolutely experiencing surges.
Can I mention another one that's very popular what about Arizona State? I know it's more in the Southwest.
No,
but
absolutely.
That's a very popular choice for kids now.
Absolutely, in Arizona as well. Arizona State as well. Yeah. So, but I'm going to share something because it's hot off the press. So, David Graves, who you guys will hear on this podcast, he's coming on later in 2023, who's over the admission office at UGA. He's a fantastic follow on Twitter. And so he put a post up literally right after you and I were talking about this. Now, this won't surprise you, Dave. Georgia won the national championship last year.
Yeah.
And UGA was already very difficult to get in. I mean, I had a kid last year, 4.0 private school, 1560 SAT deferred. So it was already a tough admit, and that was a strong kid. Now, they did take him in the regular round, but still. So he puts a post up and he says 21% increase from last year to this year in early action. So he knows that because you'll see this in the South. There are quite a few Southern schools that actually have 10-15 deadlines. That can throw people off. But you'll see your 10-15 deadlines for your UNC Chapel Hills, for your Clemsons, for your Georgias. So by now they have the data. They can look at how many applications came in. These are early action deadlines. It's not like if you miss it, you're done. But for early action. So Dave is great. And so I started interacting with him a lot on Twitter, back and forth about a number of things. And one of the things I said was, and I've been saying this to him for a while, like, you guys won the national championship. The research shows next year you're going to blow up. And so he commented on that. He said, we've been talking to our staff about that. We were prepared for that, the national football bump that you get. But then, I said to him, I would bet more of your growth was out of state than in state. And he said, absolutely, we've experienced growth in both, but out-of-state is booming. This is this week, hot off the press. So here's how much the growth has occurred. One thing Georgia used to do, and they were very, very unique in this, and they're different than even Georgia Tech on this in a lot of ways. They used to say, we are the school that does not look at gender at all in admissions. We do not look at residency, meaning in-state, out-of-state, non-factor. We do not look at race. They got sued a while ago over, Georgia's actually not one of the 9 states that prohibits affirmative action, but they got sued a while ago and then they got scared and they basically self-imposed that they don't look at race themselves, even that, it's not a state mandated thing like you see in those other states. And Georgia Tech functions differently, but Georgia does not look at state, has not looked at race, it has not looked at gender, it has not looked at residency, and it has not looked at alumni status. Being very different because a lot of schools look at alumni, gender, race, and residency. So they've had such a surge, Dave, in out of state that that basically David Graves flat out came out and said that they have to factor residency now.
Yeah,
because it's the state taxpayers in Georgia paying. And people don't want to pay money. I mean, we've talked about this. We saw that. That's what happened in California, right? The backlash.
Yeah.
There, nobody wants to be paying all the state taxpayer dollars. You can't get in your own flagship. We see that. We've seen what that's produced with Texas and the backlash there, and we've seen that
North Carolina.
Virginia's got the same issues. Any of these schools that have very competitive, that have national applicant pool, and the national applicants are gobbling up a lot of spots, and there's a backlash from the locals. So there it is right there. Now let's look at another school, Georgia Tech. When Rick Clark got to Georgia Tech 17 years ago, 62% admit rate. Last year, 13% out of state. So what's going on? I just shared those because Florida State, Georgia, and Georgia Tech are 3 examples that weren't even mentioned. And I agree everything with what they said. I've seen students I work with all across the country that are coming to Southern schools. And they picked great ones, by the way, that are examples. Like, absolutely, SMU, TCU are hot. I'll make a prediction right now, Dave. SMU and TCU are going to be the new Emory and Vanderbilt. Watch it.
Wow.
The only thing that SMU and TCU don't have right now, they don't have the endowment. But right now, SMU's got a $450 million fundraising initiative going into financial aid. And both those schools are hot, and they're going to continue to get hot because, for one, they're great schools. And the other thing is, and this is one point the article didn't make, the South is growing. And you mentioned Arizona. The West is growing. So as these areas grow, more and more people come to them, more and more people vacation here, more and more people get comfortable with that. And that's why, look at TCU. It's the 12th biggest state in the Fort Worth is now the 12th biggest city. Our current interview with Trinity, San Antonio, the 7th biggest city. And then Dallas, I think Dallas is 6th. So those places are experiencing fast growth. That's another factor. But as I've taken a look at why are people coming to all of these schools, because I see it.
Right.
I've said this on many occasions. The last 2 years, I've had more inquiries about Clemson than I had in my 21 years before that. What's going on? And so I'll just hit on it really quickly. You hit on most of them. We can have a conversation.
Yeah.
No question about it. This is not necessarily in order, but these are all the things. No question about it. I have lots of people that want to come to Southern schools because of weather. I mean, they just say it. They'll say, I get seasonal depression, in the winter, or I hate cold. And so, I mean, it's why so many of us are here. It's a big reason I'm here. I was out talking to my next door neighbor. I have one neighbor from California to the right, the other one to the left from Ohio. This is last year. He had just moved in. He's like, is this the way it always is here in October? I was like, yeah, man, normal. He's like, man, I should have moved here a long time ago. Sorry, Ohio. Just had to say that one. So no question weather. Second, I'll just call this fun, Dave.
Yeah.
When people look and they see big crowds and face painting and tailgating and then the whole sorority scene with the girls and the frat, it just looks like it would be fun. And the idea for a lot of people is going to college and having fun is great.
And guess what? Beaches are also a lot of fun. And I have students who tell me, I want to be close to the beach. And you have great beaches in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Florida. So this benefits schools like UNC Wilmington, University of South Florida, Tampa, University of Miami, College of Charleston, and many others. All these places benefit from being close to the beach.
Couple quick stories on this one. I was working with a student from Seattle last year, and she was all set to go to a bunch of schools. And both her parents actually have degrees from the University of Washington, so decided to take a trip. University of Washington was playing Michigan. We're gonna go to Ann Arbor and watch the football game. It messed with her whole college list. She came out of there and said, 100,000 people, something is going on there. There's a buzz. And it got her really excited in that. I'll tell you another quick story. So obviously Joy, she's Georgia grad. She's got that in her blood. And she's one of the people in her clinical mental health counseling program that graduated last year is an Alabama grad. Now, that's another one they didn't talk about that much here that we absolutely could have talked about. But
absolutely.
Yeah, Alabama,
Nick
Tuscaloosa.
Saban.
Well, yeah, but just the way they're recruiting out of state. I mean,
Yeah, that's right.
4 of the last 5 years, more than 60% of kids have been out of state. It's actually quite a national school right now. But anyway, so this was a student. In fact, she's one. She didn't come. She's not from Alabama. She's from North Carolina, and she went to school in Alabama. And so she's hardcore football. Every time they play Alabama and Georgia, they throw a big party, food, all that. Everybody comes over. Everybody's wearing the jersey, all that. So literally last week, Joy calls me. Where are you? I'm in Knoxville, Tennessee. What happened? Her and her friend hopped in the car because Tennessee was playing Alabama. It's just fun. And you know what? When you think of all the things that people could do, this is one of the cleanest versions of fun out there. It's a lot more things you could get in trouble with.
Right.
So that fun, whether it's the face painting, the tailgating, the sorority scene, the cheering, and then with the SEC dominating college football, you're on national TV all the time. You're seeing that, and it just looks like fun. I know for me, that was my idea of fun when I thought of fun in college. It was going to all these sports games, and Magic Johnson influenced me to go to Michigan State. Third thing, which this article didn't talk about because it's town and country, but in general, cost. So what happens with Southern schools, first of all, they're very big for merit money. I mean, look at the National Merit finalists. Look at the huge awards that you're seeing from the Southern schools. Not to mention even not being National Merit. Look at they tend to be very big merit money schools. They all give merit money. And if you're looking for a financial bargain, your money can go really far. So that's another factor. A fourth one, you did mention it, Dave, the anti-wokeness. There's no question about it. I have worked explicitly with multiple students. I work with multiple students every year that want to leave, that are more interested in Southern schools because of they're perceived as more conservative. I can think of somebody right now that's out at South Carolina for that reason. I can think of somebody else that picked Georgia for that reason. I can think of somebody else that picked Furman in South Carolina for that reason. I can think of somebody else that ended up picking Richmond, but they came very close to picking TCU. So, and in every case, they didn't like the policy on masks, or they just felt like they're in a place where they're only hearing one view. And here's one thing I will say about the Southern schools. Young kids are liberal, Dave. So even when if you looked at the mock election in Auburn, Alabama, and Tuscaloosa, do you know that those places still went blue?
Oh,
So it's
absolutely.
it's not like you're getting 95-5 unless you're trying to go to like Bob Jones or something.
Yeah.
You're getting more of the 50-50, or I mean, Athens is a liberal bastion. It went 75-25, Athens, Georgia.
Clark County, where Athens is located and UGA is located, went over 75% for Biden. You can look it up. Remember, college professors and young people tend to be more liberal.
So, but they'll feel like both views get heard in the class. And then another thing is, you brought up acceptance rates. People tired of dealing with the stress. Some of the schools are really competitive. You trying to get in UNC Chapel Hill out of state is tough. Trying to get in Duke is tough. Trying to get in UT Austin out of state is tough. Trying to get into, Virginia is a Southern school. And I mean, I can mention all of them. I mean, last year, Dave, Miami had a 19% acceptance rate.
Yeah.
I worked with one student that got in multiple UCs out of state and got flat out denied from Miami. So some of the schools don't have low acceptance rates, but there are quite a few more. And like the article pointed out, like TCU and SMU are very, very good schools, but they're not as hard to get into as Vanderbilt or Emory.
Right.
So anyway, those are my thoughts. What do you think? Where do you want to discuss further?
I just want to echo most of what you said. And, if you think about where the population shifts are occurring in this country, they're going to the South and Southwest for all the reasons that you already cited. Number one, job opportunities. Number two, cost of living. Number three, warmth. Number four, culture. You could list them. It's the same things. And, I was looking at a list that the cities that are all about to double in size in the next 20 to 30 years. Well, they were Atlanta. They were Dallas. They were Austin. They were multiple cities in Florida. They were Phoenix. So it just makes sense that the students follow these population trends, because think about it. What do you want to do when you get out of college? Get a job, find a place to live, settle down. And we all know that the regional universities have a far greater impact on on your economic prospects than the national ones. I mean, no matter how good Harvard is, it's not going to compete with University of Georgia if you're looking at forming connections in Atlanta. Similarly, going to Alabama and staying in Huntsville, which is now called Rocket City, USA, or if you're going out to Phoenix and the ties you can get from Arizona and Arizona State. So I think students are doing the right, hopping on the right economic bandwagon, going to where the weather's warmer, where the opportunities are greater, and where they don't have to deal with the stress of yesterday, because we know that the Northeast is not where it's happening in terms of population and economic growth trends. So I think this is all great. Anything that can diversify people's choices and make them realize that there's so much more to college choice than reading U.S. News and World Report, I think that's fantastic.
And one thing I'll say, I'll speak specifically about Georgia here, because both my kids went to school in the South. Davidson for my oldest, and then Georgia for my youngest. They really do have a good balance between serious academics and fun, and not overly stressful. Right. Like, I think people do have fun at these places, but yet they still get a good education. They're not the place fun goes to die.
Yeah.
The other thing that I'll say, and I'm thinking back of all the families I've worked with that have left, that have come to Southern schools from different regions of the country. And in many cases, I would say there was one or two things that they had in common. Either there was some relative that lived in a Southern location, and so there was some time spent there when you would, go visit Aunt Judy or Uncle Bert or whatever, or they vacationed there. And let's just take the state of North Carolina. If you look at every North Carolina school, and I'm talking about particularly the schools that really pull outside of the region. So I'm talking Davidson, I'm talking Duke, talking UNC Chapel Hill, I'm talking Elon. I mean, even schools like in Wake Forest, certainly talking about, North Carolina State, and certainly even schools like, High Point, I would include there in this mix. Not to mention, North Carolina has a lot of very prominent HBCUs, like NCAD and North Carolina Central and Winston-Salem, and where Stephen A. Smith went. Got to get that in. One thing you'll find with those North Carolina schools, they really pull very heavily from Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia.
Yeah.
They just do. And why is it? Because, as somebody who lived in Philly from 95 to 09, people vacation in the Carolinas.
Yeah.
You go to the Carolinas, you go to South and North Carolina because you can get beaches. If you're watching your budget, you can drive it. It's very drivable. You don't need airfare for 4 people and then rent a car. I mean, we would always vacation there. I mean, how many times we've done vacations in Myrtle Beach and in the Outer Banks and all these places. And so there just gets a comfort level from vacationing or from visiting Uncle Bob or Aunt Betty or something. And that creates a comfort level, and then it allows people to kind of launch out. So that's something that I've seen. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, that's true. The quality of Chicago is that there's a connect line between Chicago to Nashville, because that's where if you're going down south, you're going through Nashville, Tennessee, and you're cutting up through Oklahoma, Texas, and part of Missouri. And guess what? The popular schools for kids is University of Missouri, Vanderbilt, and then we do have quite a bit of a connection to some of those Texas schools. So, where the highway leads is often where the students follow. So,
yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned Nashville, because that is a city that is hot,
Yeah.
Now, listen, one thing I will say, there are parts of the South that are struggling still, but they tend to be more little westerns, a little farther west, like Arkansas. You're not seeing that on the coastal side. If you go right down the coast, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia and Florida, they're all booming. And so there's some correlation between the hot schools and the hot places for growth, which you pointed out earlier. There's still pockets that are struggling. Mississippi is still struggling. Mississippi has to do great incentivization to get kids through merit scholarships. But you know what? They say everybody's got a price. I mean, some of the offers I've seen Mississippi State put on the table, they get people still because, there's going to be a certain shopper, and that doesn't mean they don't have some good programs. Even more conservative, and that culture is going to be right for a certain person. But I find that the places where you don't see as much tourism is not as much interest. Like, I don't have as many people. People are not asking me about Mississippi, and they're not asking me about Arkansas. And they're not generally asking me about Oklahoma unless it's a special program Oklahoma just has we've done a spotlight on them. They have 6 or 8 really, really killer strong programs. Like one of the best ballet programs in the country, and we've talked about petroleum engineering. We talked about if you want to be an anchor weatherman. I mean, that's where the tornadoes so Oklahoma will get interest for some of their specialized programs. But all the places where people are asking, I notice are the hot places. They correlate with your job growth places. It's Texas, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. Yeah. So good stuff, Dave.
Yeah. And just a corollary with that, unfortunately for those places, it matters if there's not a direct flight.
Yeah, no.
I mean, if you have to take a connecting flight and get on the bus or get on and go an hour and a half, that cuts down on your chances of actually visit the campus. So the regional isolation of some of these places is tough for them.
I just literally last night, this is a family that is in Georgia, would like to stay in Georgia, but I was telling the mom that, boy, the University of Richmond is a great match for your kid. And what did the mom say? You know what? There's an airport in Richmond. Flights are cheap. I'm good with Richmond. Yeah. But if I would have said, another location without that direct flight, and a lot of times people will actually put that on our survey, Dave. They'll say close to an international airport is a priority, especially internationals. Yeah. And I actually encourage people to do that. When you think of that, you need to think of your path. Like, what's it? If getting there is going to be an indirect 9-hour flight, and then it's 3 hours away, I'll give you another thing. I was just talking to a family in Illinois, and I recommended App State for them. I thought App State was a really good match. And at the end of the day, it didn't make their final list, and we were going over that, and they said, you know what, we took a look at the transportation. We weren't going to be able to get direct flights, and then we're going to have to fly into Charlotte if we did, and then it was going to be like a 2.5-hour probably Uber ride. Yeah. So that kind of nixed it off the list. So you bring up another good point, transportation routes. Yeah. And Dallas and Fort Worth, San Antonio, these places are booming. They're only going to grow. Yeah, no, they are. So what are the takeaways?
Well, my takeaways is, number one, college choices have never been greater. Number two, that if you want weather, warm culture, lower acceptance rate, great Division I schools, then you're not
and good cost.
And good cost, then Southern Illinois is struggling a bit. We're not going to compete with Georgia. We're not winning a national championship anytime soon, and global warming is not progressing fast enough to make our region of the country competitive. So I don't know what y'all going to do.
Well, at least you own it, man. At least you own it. Good stuff, my friend.
Good.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Julia, you are part of the big experiment today, something we've never, ever done, which is take 2 different people, start out with Lisa, finish with you, all part of one question. So you up for the big experiment?
I am. I love this.
All right. So I know you've heard parts 1 and 2, so you have a sense of context. Obviously, we're looking at all the reasons why schools routinely admit people with lower test scores, lower GPA over higher test scores and higher GPA. And I thought you would be so great to talk about because I love the work you've done with College Horizons. I know it's a real passion for you. And we really never talk that much about a CBO here, community-based organization, other than Questbridge. So why don't you start out and give our listeners an overview of who College Horizons is, what your involvement's been with them. Just take it where you want to go with it.
Sure. So College Horizons has actually been out for a little bit, I believe since the 90s. It was actually started by a non-Indigenous woman named Whitney Laughlin. And after incredible amounts of work on her behalf, the executive director is now Carmen Lopez, who is from the Navajo Nation herself. College Horizons is the largest college access program for Native American and Indigenous youth in the United States. So the typical sort of experience is actually for students applying to college, but College Horizons has done so well that they also have two other branches. They have a Graduate Horizons program. So that's for Native American students looking for graduate programs. And then they also have the Scholars Program, where it's sort of like not a bridge program, but it's sort of getting students ready for what college life might be like. So after they graduate from high school, it's usually always hosted at Lawrence University. Huge shout out to Lawrence University, one of the few sort of colleges out there that don't have these giant endowments that basically fully fund most students, and they offer this program for free. And then their faculty, including also Dr. Adrienne Keene, who, not to shout out another podcast on our podcast, but I cannot, I cannot recommend all my relations enough. It's Dr. Adrienne Keene, and she's currently a professor at Brown, but she's done a lot of her academic work on Native American cultural appropriation, also a lot about Native Americans and higher education. She herself is Cherokee. So what I'm involved with College Horizons is usually twice a summer, about 100 Indigenous youth, either rising juniors or rising seniors, will descend on one of two college campuses in the United States. Also, the college will take on the cost of hosting the program. So it's an investment. It's a significant investment on colleges' parts. And there's many College Horizon partner colleges. Every Ivy League is a partner college. And then anything from some large state schools or to some small liberal arts schools. It's a really great list. You can go on their website to check. But the admission officers from those colleges will also come to this campus. So at any given time, we have over 200 people. It's almost like a 1-to-1 faculty to student ratio at College Horizons. We wear shorts, we wear t-shirts, we all live in the dorms together. And the majority of the students, everyone's a little different, but every student needs to be tribally enrolled and have an affiliation with their tribe. So this is not sort of the like, oh, I did a 23andMe and it says I'm,
1/1000.
Exactly. So, and consequently, a lot of the students do come from the reservation, or they might come from areas that are more rural. So we have a lot of students from the Navajo Nation or the different pueblos, which are in sort of New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado. And so a lot of those students live maybe miles from internet access or their high school. And they do things like hauling water, and like they have a significant sort of experience outside of school that is cultural and also locational.
Cool.
So very cool. So anyone we got Native Hawaiians, we have folks from Alaska, and then you could totally have a kid that went to my high school, but is maybe Wampanoag and is involved in their tribe and goes to powwows. So So it can really run the spectrum of some students who go to really well-resourced, even independent schools. But the majority of the students are coming from high schools that maybe send 2 to 4% of their students to four-year colleges. And maybe if they do send them to four-year colleges, they might be tribal institutions. So it's very rare that somebody from from their high school might go to a place like Bowdoin or Wash U, or most of them have heard of Harvard. So that's not usually a struggle trying to articulate Harvard. But I think it's important to note the faculty student piece, because nowhere in my life in college admissions are the most selective institutions there with actual real representatives that read the applications, not some alum like at a college fair, and they are living and learning with the students. And most of the students they meet will not apply to their institution. It is fully to connect with the most under-resourced group in higher education. Less than 1% of higher education is made up of Native or Indigenous youth in the United States. So it's a really underrepresented group. So all of these colleges come together to try to help students apply to a four-year college, or even just open their eyes about what it might mean. And it's difficult. Some of these students, there is significant risk in leaving your reservation. It's sometimes very difficult to leave and then return. So there are a lot of factors to consider when we are counseling the College Horizon students about what they might want to do in their next 4 years.
And how long have you been working with College Horizons?
Gosh, since 2008.
I know, coming up for year 15.
Yes, it is. For any admission officer that's involved in it, like, they will all tell you it is their favorite thing in the world. And it is my favorite thing in the world. It is like Christmas when I go to College Horizons. Unfortunately, it's been virtual the last 3 summers, because I think, as folks know, the pandemic has also disproportionately hit Native American folks more than any other racial group. So we are hopeful, and get this, Mark, the 2 locations this summer for College Horizons are Emory. So,
yay!
Yeah, I'm really hoping to.
We'll connect. We'll definitely connect.
And then they've got University of Redlands this year. So we're really excited to be back, mostly because my favorite piece is that we usually have like a heritage night where the students, with permission from their elders, depending on your tribe, sometimes a student's not allowed to sort of talk about the stories or cultural sharing, but usually they'll get permission from their elders, and they put on this usually like 4 to 5 hour show for us, showcasing their beadwork or their shawl dancing, or anything that is totally something I would never interact with in my daily life. And it is really magical, and I will defend these kids to the end of time. And I think they are the most amazing people I've ever met.
If I ever want to talk to Julia when she's in her absolute best of best move, it's like when College Horizons is coming up and it's getting close.
Yes.
She's just walking on the clouds. It just jumps through the phone. So talk a little bit about the testing, standardized testing. What type of profiles do you see from them, and what type of profiles will the selective colleges say, you know what, if other things are strong in the application, we're okay with this kind of testing because we're confident that you can do the work and excel in our program?
Absolutely. That's another really good thing about College Horizons, is that sometimes if you've got a student who's not been exposed to sort of what a lot of our more privileged folks would be exposed to, they can often have a conversation with the admission officer, because context matters so much. And a lot of what might be some soft skills that students can bring that will help them succeed are not accurately captured in a test score whatsoever. So most of the students that go to College Horizons will end up taking the ACT just because of sort of regionally where they're located. And in the past, obviously, because of testing sort of not availability as well, I have less and less sort of anecdotal data I'm working with.
Sure.
But typically for my students who maybe go to a public high school that sends less than 5% of their students onto a 4-year college, a lot of those students might not be taking a standardized test anyway. So there is very little testing culture already. And so when they go to take the ACT, even if they maybe have like an AP English class or they've taken AP courses, they will often score pretty low on the ACT compared to maybe the students I work with here at Milton Academy. That being said, I have seen MIT admit a student with a 22 ACT. I have seen Harvard admit a student with a 490 in the math on the SAT from College Horizons. And that's because the colleges do know, most of them do know that testing is not the full picture, and trying to find those sort of soft skills as well as understanding the context really matters. So that 22 ACT is like 99th percentile for that student. Whereas in Massachusetts, where I am, even outside of Milton Academy, that would not be anywhere near 99th percentile, right? This is Massachusetts has a huge emphasis on sort of education, and there is more money, and so students are better prepared to score higher, and their incomes are higher. Therefore, they might score higher on standardized testing. And so when you think about the factors of everything that goes into testing, so we're talking about race, we're talking about access to education, we're talking about the culture surrounding that, it makes sense that even if a 22 feels low to one of our listeners, that is, and you mentioned this too, Mark, when you're talking to Lisa, that is like, whoa, like what is this kid doing? How did they possibly score this high when sort of that is really outside of the norm based on resources? So these students will usually have all A's. They clearly care about what they're doing. And the fact that even they went to College Horizons means, hey, I am interested in attending a 4-year college. I am being serious about my pursuing this. And so with sort of all of these factors, a college is able to sort of look beyond the fact that maybe that score is low for them, but it's really high for what that student's background is. And therefore, they're happy to admit someone. I do think there are probably colleges, and I think this is part of MIT's move to require testing again, is that there might be like a threshold score. And I just want to use Carmen Lopez as the director's words here, which is that does not mean you're not ready for college. It means the college wasn't ready for you.
Ooh, I like that.
Exactly, right? So it just means that it doesn't mean you can't be an engineer or you can't do all of those things. It just meant the college did not have the resources to support someone because maybe your high school did not have the same resources as a lot of the students who are also applying to these selective institutions.
So a couple of things. I'm so glad you agreed to come on in addition to your normal monthly, because I think this is just so helpful for everyone to hear this, myself included. So one point I want to make is these colleges are not in the business of admitting people that can't do the work.
Right.
And I actually looked this up, but College Horizons has an 85% for 4-year graduation rate, 4 to 5 year graduation rate, normally 4. Okay, that is exceptionally high. So it's not like they're admitting these kids and then they're just flunking out.
Right.
And so that's the first thing. And then I want to ask you a question. Do you think I was too harsh in the last episode when I said if any of us hear this and we think, wow, it's so much easier for them than it is for me, then we're probably not in touch with our own class entitlement and the benefits we've gotten from our parents and from the schooling that we've had. If that's sort of our gut wrench, visceral, reflexive reaction when we hear, wow, kids are getting in Harvards with, 490 maths and MITs with 22s, and I'm here with my 770 math and I got waitlisted. Do you think that was too harsh, Julia?
I don't think it's too harsh. And we actually do talk about this at Milton with our students. The notion of distance traveled and how
Mm-hmm.
all of these factors will play a part. It is not the singular reason, but will play a part in a college reviewing a student's candidacy. And this will be very, as Lisa mentioned too, very apropos as we go into the Supreme Court hearing cases for UNC and Harvard in terms of race conscious admissions, is that it is that also, like, just to give you an example of a student that I work with at College Horizons, the typical student I might have did not have a sibling or parents that went to college. There is often a lot of the students do live below the poverty line. And if you live on a reservation as well, I mentioned hauling water. So maybe I have a student that takes about an hour to get to school every day. They go to school from 8 to 2 p.m. They ride an hour home during the day. A lot of the time, because of the sort of treatment by our government to Native American folks, is because of the limited resources in terms of health. That a lot of our Native youth do have an instance of alcoholism in their families. I very rarely do I work with a student who hasn't had a significant loss of a family member. And these are 14-year-old students, 15-year-old students I'm meeting. And maybe they go home, maybe they haul water, maybe they're responsible for taking care of their siblings. Maybe they've got a parent that is working full-time or a single parent. And so it's going to be a lot harder for you to be like, let me log on to Khan Academy when I don't even have internet access and, just study for the SAT in the 2 hours I do not have whatsoever. So when you think about it, it's not that it's just like, oh, here I am because I'm Indigenous or Native. Like, you can look past that. It's the fact that even if we were to give Indigenous and Native youth the same resources, there is so much that has happened in history and over time that stands in the way of being able to quickly catch up, for lack of a better word, with maybe a majority peer who is able to get those really high test scores. So I think Lisa said it really well, which is when her children got their test scores back, sort of like, well, yeah, like, you had the resources you need to be successful on this. And so I wouldn't say it's necessarily easier, but we have to think about what are all the other things in the way. I personally, my queen, Kimberly Crenshaw, I think describes sort of affirmative action in my favorite way, where I think a lot of folks think, especially when it comes to Native American and Indigenous admissions, is that let's say you've got two runners and one is a Native and one is a white student, that they believe that the way it works is that the Native student is allowed to start earlier in the race. Kimberly Crenshaw would say, no, that's not how it works. Essentially, that in the track of the white student is a smooth, nice track. The track of the Native American student has a super bumpy track. So of course they're going to have to run slower because there's all of these things in the way. And so even if you start them at the same time, there's no way the under-resourced folks can win, right? Mm-hmm. So it's all taken into context, and it's important too it's not just like, oh, look, we have a Native applicant. Admit that's not how it works. They're still fully underrepresented in the admissions process. So it's not like you're getting a ton of kids applying. I will tell you this too, as College Horizons, the partner schools are generally all selective schools. Some are uber selective, like Stanford, and then some are a little kinder, like Indiana, for example. The majority of the College Horizons students are still not getting admitted to the partner colleges at College Horizons because they still don't have enough resources, and they're still so underrepresented that colleges aren't ready to support them either. And the notion of critical mass is important here. When I did multicultural recruitment, I couldn't just make the case that we had a really totally admissible student, But what was our responsibility for bringing the student onto campus when we had no Native American center, we had no Native American studies, no Native American faculty, very few, if maybe one other Native student who might not even identify with their tribe? What are the ethics of us admitting that student, even if they're admissible? Because how will they be successful, socially? How do they find community in a place that's not prepared to support them? So also colleges are not just like, oh, yay, that's so exciting, let's do this. They think very critically about, if they can admit the student, how will they support that student?
This is all so great, so great. Thank you so much, Julie, for coming on. A question for you. From a college standpoint, obviously they see value, or they wouldn't be either paying for the whole thing, which you said is really expensive, or sending admission officers trekking all the way across the country. So what do they get out of it?
I will say this. In my time of doing College Horizons for 5 years while I worked at Haverford, we never got a student from College Horizons. And what I get out of it is sort of, I'm going to steal sort of my boss Rod Skinner's line here, is sort of the cognitive value of diversity, which is being able to be in community with people that stretch my ability to understand my place in the world and to make me a more empathetic and better person. It is also very important, I think, to listen to the stories of these students, especially when college admissions is dominated by a lot of white people. And there are a lot of these selective colleges, if not all of them, are predominantly white or historically white institutions. And so it is good, a reminder for us that all work in selective admissions, that the average person's experience is maybe not going to be applying to these selective schools. I've also learned so much from these students who are so gracious to share their cultural stories, to share their own personal stories. So I get a lot out of it, and learning to be better human, a less divided society. A lot of the students too are actually, one of my old students did coin this term, and we use it a lot at College Horizons, which is there is ancestral trauma, but there is ancestral stamina too. And there is something really beautiful about sort of hearing everyone's stories. And then I can't think of another place in our country where the fight to preserve culture is so strong and alive and well. And these students carry an intense responsibility. Some of them, there's like maybe 3 people in their tribe that speak the language. And so they want to make sure that they speak the language and pass it down. Being exposed to these things really makes you a better person in general, and also a much better admissions professional when you're able to really understand context, and you're able to understand that sort of the shortest distance between 2 people is a single story, or is a story. And so having that connection across difference is really powerful.
Can you talk about the benefit to the entire student body if somebody does matriculate and come into the school, and why a school would say, you know what, we'll go way out of our profile, we'll put support systems in place because this is what we get if we do matriculate somebody? Like, you want to comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. So, and a lot of these schools have, University of New Mexico, shout out to them, Harvard, actually. But then even, some larger state schools, even some small liberal arts schools, they will have a Native American center, and that group of students will usually put on events and whatnot that do educate the greater community. They bring to class, that will bring stories and a perspective that many others don't see. A lot of what I am seeing with my students who now go on to college and they come from Milton, they have never met an Indigenous person in their life. A lot of them come back to me having a more nuanced understanding of environmentalism as well as sustainability, and realizing also how much of American culture has stolen ideas, and also how much we've sort of destroyed the land in many ways. Also historically, to understand, I think my students at Milton are very lucky to get a more nuanced look at history, but the average person, including myself, until I went to College Horizons, had no idea the depth of the history. And it's really important, just like having anyone from another country, having someone from a different race, someone from a different city, a different background, anyone can give you a different perspective. And so bringing that to class, also showing your culture and how that might be different, showing your connection with things and how that might be different, all enhances the social and learning growth of students at college. And there's actually been a lot of good research on this. So for the Supreme Court, a lot of amicus briefs have been filed, including by the military, about what is the value of having different opinions and perspectives, and how that creates actually better solutions and more connection and more creativity. And so it does inspire people to think more innovatively and in new ways.
Good stuff. Good stuff. So let's go all the way back to the original question. What are the reasons why schools routinely take kids with lower test scores and lower GPAs over kids with higher? Because I still continue, and I know you hear it because you and I talk, that surprises people when that happens. It feels unfair to them. Mm-hmm. It feels like those are the metrics that should be used. And if you're using other metrics, you're disadvantaging me. Mm-hmm. Anything you want to add to this discussion at all about, reasons why that happens, either something you've heard you want to underscore or a thought you want to leave with our listeners?
I really appreciated everything you and Lisa had chatted about, which is also the notion of institutional priorities, also the notion of fit. I think we see it the most with our students at the very most selective colleges. Like the college admits less than 25% of the students, where even though my students maintain they know each other's scores and transcripts, which I highly doubt. It is true. I might have a student whose GPA is lower and maybe a test score is lower, but they would be admitted over a student who looked fancier on paper. And that might be because they decided, I want to go for Spanish literature, and the other student was going for a major that is overrepresented at the college. And they could see that the student who wanted to study Spanish literature totally had the goods to get admitted already. So then when you're looking at that pool of all of the students who are considered for admission, which even at selective colleges is the majority of applicants, sort of who is in this top band, and in that top band might have some lower GPAs, but they might be admitted because they're in that top band for a variety of reasons. Maybe they showed a real significant passion for Spanish literature. So it wasn't like, oh, let me pick something kind of random and hope that it works out for me. It was clear that that's what they wanted to study. And they had identified a selective college that offered that program in a very strong way. And also too, sometimes it just comes down to the fit, right? I might have some really lovely students who on paper have all the right grades, all the right scores, and for whatever reason, somebody else had something that was just particularly compelling to that particular college. But then it could be not compelling to another equally selective college. So sometimes I'll have my students apply to the most selective. They might get one out of all of the most selective. And they're like, that makes no sense. Like, it's the same score range. It's the same sort of curriculum and grades at all of these uber selective schools. How come one said yes and then everyone else said no, like not even a wait list? And it's because that particular school had something in your profile was just that extra bit you needed to be pushed into the admit pile. One of my favorite sort of stories on top of College Horizons to sort of illuminate this is there is a community-based organization that is so much larger than when I used to work with it called College Match. It's in Los Angeles, started by a white guy named Harley Frankel, who was lucky enough that he was successful enough to send his children to Harvard Westlake, which is sort of like the end all be all of independent schools in the Los Angeles area. And he realized that his kids were no smarter than a kid at a public school, or no smarter than a kid who grew up with a single mother who didn't speak English. And that it really just was the resources that wasn't allowing them to sort of look the same on paper. And so when he started College Match, the first thing he did was just pay for SAT tutoring. That's it, for high achieving students in the Los Angeles public school system, which, to give you an idea, that's a very under-resourced school district. Most of the high schools, maybe 2 to 4%, will go on to a 4-year college.
And that was part of your recruiting territory for a while.
Yes, it was. Yes, exactly. And so what Harley did is just pay for his organization paid for the tutoring of SATs for 2 times for students to take it. With the tutoring, their scores would shoot up to a place where maybe before a student might apply and have like an 800 SAT. At Haverford, that was just a little too low for us to know that the student would be successful, especially in like a STEM-based program. But with Harley, they would move that up to a 600, and we were happy to submit to admit at a 600 or a 1200 SAT, even something in the 500s. We were happy to do that because we saw, like, look, if you just get a little tutoring, look at what you can do. So we knew that they would have what it takes to be admitted. And I would be so much more happy to take one of my students from a Los Angeles public high school where likely no one in their family has even made it out of Los Angeles. Very few people speak. A lot of the families I worked with did not speak English. So having to navigate the financial aid process and everything alone as a child without teachers, without parents, and then still get admitted. This is why it's such a long distance travel to be admitted. Is that it's still not easy. It took everything for them to be admitted to these really selective schools. So even though they had lower test scores, we have to think about all the other things that they can bring to the school and all the other things they experienced that still got them to a place that might feel below average for these standardized metrics.
And the truth is, we've just scratched the surface with all the different groups this could apply to. Right. Yes. It could be the rural kid. It could be the kid from, Appalachia, the parents who are drugs or drug addicted. It could be older, non-traditional kids, community college kids, like so many military kids. I mean, there's so many different groups that would add a lot to a campus because they'd be bringing a unique and distinct perspective that would elevate everybody's education and broaden everybody's perspective. And a college is just not going to look at it like through that lens of test scores, GPA are the metrics that confer value.
Right.
And you brought up something really interesting too, which is majors can play a big role, even beyond schools that just admit by major.
Yep.
Just schools that don't, even your liberal arts school. If you're getting someone that you don't see that often, that makes the kid more interesting and unique.
Yep.
By their interests. Or you may know that, there's talk that we're going to have to close down our German, department or lay people off if we don't get more interest here.
Exactly.
And so all of those things can be going on behind the scenes, and we don't want to lose this incredible professors we have. But if we don't start seeing some more students show some interest, then layoffs are going to happen. So now you're prioritized because you're bringing something, valuable into the community, even that academically your profile may not be what somebody else's is. So hopefully, I just was hoping that in this conversation, it should not be surprising to anybody if they hear about kids getting in schools with lower test scores, lower GPAs, because it's just so much more complicated than that. In fact, Julia, the example I like to always use is an employment context. If you have a business and you have 6 or 8 people in your office and you need to make some hires, you're not just going to say, okay, who had the highest GPA? Who had the highest test score? That's who I'm bringing into my company.
Right.
You're going to say who has these skills that we need. You're going to say who will fit in well with who's already here. What perspectives do we not have that we need to have around the table, to strengthen and stretch, everybody we already have. It's so much more complicated. Nobody really does hiring by saying, oh, this kid had a 3.86 when he graduated and this one had a 3.49. So I don't even really need to look at them. I don't need to interview them. I don't need to check references. I don't need to learn about character. I don't need to learn about skill sets because 3.86 is better than 3.49. That's not how any organization thinks when they're trying to create a community.
Exactly. Even in I'll say this. So I used to, before my admissions, or I took a brief interlude in my admissions career, and I got my master's in public health, and I worked in research affiliated with Harvard School of Public Health and Harvard Medical School. Like we are getting, and I was responsible for hiring the research teams. And so we would get resumes from the most selective colleges, right? Stanford grads, Harvard grads, Brown grads. And you know what? My worst research assistants were all from those schools. My best research assistants maybe had a high school diploma and they worked in the community that we were researching. It is not, I would much rather, and I needed to build a team, not based on these sort of false metrics that don't actually show someone's value or skills or potential or capability. And so you do have to think about how those are not, unfortunately, they're not synonymous with one another. And so when you're building a team, when you're building a class, it is just like exactly as you said, Mark. You have to. That's not how someone would hire for a company.
Julia, thank you so much. Thank you for double dipping this week.
Sure.
We got
Thank
you on last week on 267, that conversation, that we had about kids and food insecurities and everything, and then we get you again on, 269. So thank you for coming on 2 straight weeks. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, I hope you heard my part 1 of my interview with Justin Doty and Paul McGinlay on Division III athletic recruiting. This is one you guys have been asking for a really long time. I asked the guys over 40 questions over a 4-part interview, and this one is power-packed with a lot of answers. Paul took the lead on this one. Justin picks up more in the next one. But normally I don't want to do a detailed overview, but I'm going to, just so you see all the things that get covered here. So in part 2, we continue the conversation with Justin and Paul about how many of their students are recruited athletes. Paul talks about how recruited athletes differs from the random athlete. Paul talks about what he looks for when an athlete reaches out to him. Paul talks about one of the things that almost every student athlete who ends up at Trinity ends up doing. Paul talks about when student athletes should start the process, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade. We get into that. Justin talks about one thing that almost every serious athlete does. Paul gives his opinion of athletic interest forms. Are they worth doing? Yes, no. Paul gives his advice on who athletes should reach out to when they reach out to the school. Paul gives his opinion on what he thinks about video, athletic video, and how long should a video be. And then Paul shares the one thing that's actually better than video. And then Paul answers the question, how can a student know if an invitation to an ID camp is an attempt to generate revenue or a reflection of the fact that the school has genuine interest in the student? So I know that was a mouthful, but I really wanted to tease you and incentivize you. Listen and enjoy.
Thinking about your tough question, now I want to go back and run that stat.
Yeah.
I'm curious to see what that would look like. But honestly, from an admission standpoint, and a lot of this probably is the fact that these coaches have been here and we have tremendous respect because I feel like they truly are targeting the right kinds of students who will be successful. Sure. But whenever we run the stats on GPA, test scores, graduation rates, retention, it's either on par with non-athletes or slightly higher among athletes. Some of our strongest academic students truly are recruited athletes. So that, and I think that's going back to what you said. Sometimes when I go to admissions conferences, and there's this like collective groan when people start talking about athletics and coaches. And I just have not experienced that at Trinity. And of course, there are cases, right, that, just like non-athletes too, sure, that, offsides and, digging in to see if this student would be successful. But by and large, it's not the case.
I'm really glad you said that because a lot of times when, there is that presumption that athlete means dumbing down your student body.
Right.
And it's pretty typical at schools like Trinity where your student athletes have high GPAs. I think a lot of times people don't realize that, athletics requires a lot of discipline, right?
You're right.
And that's a trait that is highly correlated with doing well in school. So a lot of times that same athlete that can get up and jog at 5 or hit the gym and have put themselves on that regimen, they can also hit the library and they have good time management. And so when you say 22 to 26% are athletes, but 10% you make a case for, then that other 12 to 16 are people that they would have got in most likely even if they weren't an athlete. Would that be fair to say?
Oh,
If
yeah.
they
That's
apply?
fair to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair to say.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a self-selection process when students are looking at schools like Trinity that, they're not going to submit an application unless they feel that, they're at least in the ballpark,
That's important.
in the zip code. And we, from once the applications come through admissions, there are occasions where we'll get a call from Elena or Justin and say that, there's a soccer player on campus from California. Would you like to meet with them? And we would engage them and put them through a visit program as we would any of the recruited athletes. But what tends to happen is it's the recruited athletes rather than a random student that ends up enrolling in the program. So our work is not just covering the state of Texas, but covering coast to coast. If you look at our rosters, they're populated by students all over the country, and then unusually all over the world. We've had as many as 9 countries represented on our soccer roster in the mid-2000s. So it's really, even our teams mirror the profile of the university with, in-state, out-of-state, and international.
Nice. So let's talk about recruitment from a student standpoint. So if there's a student and they want to play a sport, and I'll say at a Division III school, or we could also say at Trinity, what should they do to get themselves on your radar? And I know there may be some things that are kind of just standard, like maybe filling out an athletic form on the website, maybe sending video. But then there are also some things that can vary sport by sport, depending on the sport. So can you kind of do a deep dive on that? Because, we've had a lot of requests for this topic. So Justin, when you suggested this, I knew this was a winner. We've had I can think of at least 4 emails that we've received that have asked us to do a deeper dive on Division III athletics.
Well, I think first of all, I think the student athletes have got to be realistic about the schools that they're looking at. So if someone was to send me an email from anywhere in the world, they would have to first jump through the academic hoop. So attaching a current transcript, the academic portion is so important.
Sure.
Attaching a current transcript as well as their athletic resume and a personalized email to me, to Coach McGinlay. You don't have to go too far to find out all the details on the website. And then get personal straight away. The difference between a generic email that's gone out to 100 schools and an email that's personal to the coach in the program. So I think starting there engages me, and I know the difference between a personal email and a blanket email. So that would be the first thing. I would try and reach out to them in a very short period of time, either myself or my assistant coach. And then we have to establish, and this is across the board for all 18 sports, we would establish a visit in the campus. There's hardly anyone in 3 decades that have played for us without the visit. So that shows another level of interest, whether they're in-state or out-of-state, that they're going to come down and kick the tires and stay on campus, go through the whole visit program. Because I don't want to waste their time.
Sure.
And I'm sure they don't want to waste my time. And it's just getting down to that match as quickly as possible. And it takes work. Our coaches have a preference of calling our student athletes pretty quickly into the process. So establishing a relationship with them early on and either encouraging or dismissing based on the conversations. So I would drill down personally, which is not something that student athletes at 18 years old tend to want to do. they're quite comfortable with just sending emails. But the students that end up at Trinity tend to be a little more engaging and than your average 18-year-old. And getting personal quickly is I think the best possible start to a relationship that you hope is going to last a very long time.
And if people don't know what Paul's referring to, it's not dissimilar from admissions, right? You're looking for a fit and a match.
Right.
And so you're looking for someone that you feel understands the institution a little bit, to which they're reaching out to, and is making a case why they think they may fit, so that it's not somebody, like you said, just sending willy-nilly blanketing emails to all kinds of schools of all. Yeah. So that's what you're referring to there. But it leads to a few follow-up questions.
Yep.
When ideally should this student do this? 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, spring, fall? Does it vary by sport? What are your thoughts on that?
It started to get earlier and earlier in some sports, particularly in women's soccer, volleyball. Their recruitment process tends to be a little earlier than most, and I think mainly because they're competing with Division I scholarships more than maybe football would be at the Division III level. The difference.
Football is going. It seems like now that's moving up.
Yeah, it is getting earlier and earlier. Yeah. But I would say first semester, junior year is a good time to really kick this process off. Our emphasis is obviously going to be on the rising seniors and then the rising juniors. So sophomores might be an idea to get on our radar or get onto our distribution list. But first semester, junior year is a good way to start a good time to start the college search. And that's probably the same academically also. I can imagine that.
Yeah, I was thinking this is where I feel like the hand in glove, comes into play, because in most, I feel like 99% of the cases, if they're a serious recruited student athlete, they're coming to the coach first. And then at some point, admissions is getting integrated. But, we always think about stars aligning academically, socially, financially, and then athletically. And so, and that's where we can then play a role, but it typically doesn't happen the other way, where they first come to admissions. Paul's always offering me like courtside Spurs tickets if I can bring him a recruit first, which still has not happened.
Yeah, I can tell.
Yeah,
Justin's sitting in the nosebleeds currently.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, about 6 months ago, our recommended resource was a documentary based in the Palo Alto area called Try Harder that looked at the inordinate amount of stress students are experiencing in high school. Well, today our recommended resource is a similar documentary. It just focuses more on the stress kids are experiencing in elementary school with inordinate amounts of homework in middle school, and it's called The Race to Nowhere. Vicki Abel's documentary came out in 2010, but it's as relevant today as it was then. And you can pick it up on Amazon Prime, or you can also watch it on YouTube. But it's poignant, it's powerful, it's distressing, and it's evocative, and it's absolutely worth watching. Once again, the documentary is called Race to Nowhere, and it's a recommended resource for episode 269. We will now return to my interview with Justin Doty and Paul McGinlay of Trinity University.
So a lot of times schools will drive people to like their interest form. Do you have an interest form on your website? Do you like that or not like that? Or athletes go in and fill some general stuff out, or do you prefer not to have that?
We do have it, and there is some response to it, but to drill down just that one layer deeper and go direct to the email, to email the coach is probably the best way of doing it.
And head coach, would you say head coach for each sport?
I would put head coach and assistant coach just to cover bases. Some programs, the assistant coach might dominate in the recruiting process, and
sure,
the head coach closes it. But you never know that. You never know that. So I would send it to even some of the volunteer assistants. They're all listed on the website. So when they send it to the coaching staff, I'd send it to to everyone. I sometimes get them directed just to me, and then I'll forward them to my assistant coach so that he's got record of it, and we go from there. Once they get to campus, Mark, it's a two-pronged attack. We encourage them to go through the admissions program.
Before you get to that, Paul, can I ask a question?
Sure.
What role does video play? Do you like to see a highlight clip? Do you like to see people send video or direct you to sources, whether it's, NCSA or Huddle or all these different things that are out there? I mean, what role does video play in your process? Do you like it? Do you not like it? Talk to
I
me.
do like it, but I like it if it's high quality, Mark. I mean,
Okay.
there's some videos where the student athlete is the size of an ant, and I can't even pick them out.
Sure.
So the quality of the video is most important. I would leave out their favorite music track in the background and just let the soccer footage tell the story. Also, yeah, it's not a deal breaker, but I'm not really interested in their music. I am interested in how they play. So it is an introduction, but most of the student athletes across all sports, with maybe football being the exception because they don't have club football, but are playing in the club environment.
Sure.
So it's not so much recruiting a high school athlete as it is recruiting a club athlete. And with that, we need the schedule of the current activity of the club, and then their club coach's telephone number. It's a small world. It is a small world when it comes to athletic recruitment. Doesn't matter what state in the union you are. I'm one phone call away from knowing their club coach. And that's the same across most of our head coaches. We've got a network right across the country and indeed across the world where we can get good information on the student athlete. So video's helpful, but the most helpful is attending an ID camp on campus. And some of those are 1 day, some are 3 days. There are institutions that maybe use them as revenue producing events, but it's the entire opposite to us. We want a boutique number of student athletes on campus that certainly can compete against each other, but an ideal number for us wouldn't be 100, it would be 30. And it would be 30 legitimate candidates that can play at Trinity and get in academically.
Yeah, and do all your sports have the ID camps or just certain ones?
The team sports do. The individual sports, swimming, golf, tennis, tend not to. And those track and field, they just going on times. Golf is going on scores. So not so much in those areas, but baseball, men's, women's soccer, football, volleyball, all have ID camps to try and find that perfect match.
How can a student know whether or not they're just it's a revenue producing thing, and because this is something I'll hear all the time. I just keep getting in these form letters to come attend my camp.
Right.
And that they can feel as impersonal to the athlete as some of the outreaches that you get that 100%. Can be impersonal. And so any advice or guidance on that?
Yeah. Again, transparency from the start is the best approach. And because we're not dealing with hundreds and hundreds of student athletes, our hopper at the start is not that big. But it then allows us the transparency with the student athlete and the family that they are in range. And if the student is coming in from Minnesota, for instance, and playing on a certain club team, there's certain parameters that point to this kid has the potential, and we would be transparent with them about that. But we'd also be transparent if they were offsides academically or athletically, and so that again we're not wasting each other's time.
Couple more questions. One more video question. So length of video. I know sometimes people send a highlight clip and then a half a game. And, what is your preference on length of video? Because obviously your time is valuable.
Yeah, I wouldn't go longer than 10 minutes. And it can just be a segment of a game that they're involved in. I'm not going to watch a 90-minute game,
Sure.
but a 10-minute segment and edited if they would like to do that. There's no one that's sending bad highlight tapes. Well, there are
Sure.
bad highlight tapes out there, but if you're sending a series of highlights, presumably that's what they are. But it gives us at least a starting point. It's by no means an arrival point. It's just a starting point. It's not going to make or break a situation, but it may get something started.
You know, our regular listeners know this. My youngest daughter was a pretty big time athlete in high school. So she's been through this whole process and done all this. It's interesting hearing your perspective. The one thing that she violated in your policy, though, she did have music on her video. She had to have her tunes on there.
Well, it's taking a gamble whether or not the coach likes it. But,
Sure. That's good feedback, though. Friends, this concludes the second part. We hope you'll join us next week for part 3.
And now it's time for our college spotlight of the week.
Friends, I'm with Kevin Newton, our international expert, and we're here today to talk about going to college in ancient Scotland. And so Kevin reached out to me and said, I'm getting a lot of interest in ancient Scotland. I think you're supposed to be interested. Kevin, why don't you start by telling us why ancient Scotland?
So I think the big reason is the 4 ancient universities of Scotland. By some counts, there are 5. First of all, these are among the most famous schools in Scotland. St. Andrews is one of them. In fact, St. Andrews is the oldest. Also, there's Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, and some people call Dundee one of the ancient universities of Scotland, but I'll leave it up to everyone else to decide on their own. So they're very well known, all very prestigious, all very good at what they do. But also, and this is where a lot of Americans can find some benefit, their approach to education is quite different from what we see elsewhere in the UK. In fact, you can go in and during your first 2 years, within reason, you can change your concentration. You can study things outside of your major. And those are things that you can't always do in the rest of the UK. There are some downsides. It does take 4 years to get a degree. And also one of the things we'll get to talk about, and we'll get to dig into my nerdy love of medieval history a little bit, is why undergrads from Scotland, from these 4 or 5 Scottish universities, receive master's degrees when they graduate. So I'm looking forward to it, Mark. Thanks again for having me.
No, we love having you. So in general, do you find overseas concentration is the term used for major? I mean, I know Brown University uses that term, and so do a few other schools over here. Is that how you're using the term concentration?
Really, it's just one I've kind of adopted because what they'll tend to say is a degree in whatever subject.
Mm-hmm.
So we try to break the habit of using the word major because there are some programs, especially some of the university colleges in the mainland, that do concentrations in majors, and that's applicable there, and it's much more akin to what you'd find here in the U.S. But really, if we're being as authentic as possible, we would be talking about what degree you're getting your honors in when it comes to Scotland.
Okay.
That gets to the structure of the degree, in that for those first 2 years are referred to as your sub-honors years. And you've generally got a pretty good idea of what it is you're wanting to study. So, and there are limitations. If you're going in to study art history, they're not going to let you start taking random classes in medicine. But certainly the idea is to study around and to essentially, if you want to complete coursework that's analogous in meaning, if not in name, to a minor here in the US, or perhaps you want to take classes in political science or biology or whatever it may be, there's an avenue for that. And then during your last 2 years, referred to as your honors level years, you would specialize in 1 or 2 fields at most.
So that feels very much like a U.S. school. Take 2 years to figure out what your major is going to be, declare it, whatever you want to call it, your honors, your concentration, your majors. I'm kind of using these terms interchangeably just for people to kind of get the essence of it. That feels very much like a lot of U.S. universities. Is that a big part of the appeal you find with people, that hey, you don't have to know exactly what you want to study here. You can have 2 years to figure it out.
I think that is, in fact, when American universities started to, and I could be mistaken on this, but this is how it's been explained to me. So if anyone out there feels the need to correct Mark, please let me know when they do so. That
Sure, happy
when
to.
American universities started picking and choosing the way they wanted to do things, there was a big influence from the Scottish educational system, especially these 4 universities. So again, it's not quite as broad. It's harder to go in as an undeclared major. There are a few avenues that would let you do that, or an undeclared concentration. But typically, if you know, for example, that you want to study something within the sciences or within the humanities, you can go ahead and apply for one of those degree programs that may seem the most relevant. So it could be biomedical sciences, it could be art history, it could be economics, and then alter within those first few years. Those first 2 years is you've got time to meet the prereqs so that you can switch out somewhat.
Kevin, why is St. Andrews so popular? Like, I hear more interest in St. Andrews than all the others combined, and it's been that way in the 23 years I've done this. I know when I was at Westtown Susa, worked with a number of people that ended up at St. Andrews, and I hear a little bit of the others, a little Edinburgh, a little Glasgow, but we can get to some of the others in a second. But St. Andrews is the one that just people mention to me the most. What's your explanation for that?
I think there are a number of different reasons for it, Mark. First and foremost, they've done an outstanding job of attempting to recruit American students. The St. Andrews admissions team knows more about American high school and how it works than many other countries combined. So they've really put in the effort. In fact, the only university I think that comes as close to doing such a good job outside of the US and Canada at understanding American high schools is Trinity College Dublin.
Wow.
And St. Andrews has really put in the work. Additionally, the PR is hard to beat. It's in Scotland. It's a phenomenal university. It was recently named earlier this year #1 for student satisfaction in the UK, beating out places like UCL and Oxford and Cambridge and Liverpool.
Oh, wow.
And also, there's still something of the romance. This is where the Prince of Wales met Catherine. And I think while I would be the last person to know if there are any royals there now, I think there is that idea that certainly applications ticked up when they found out that Prince William was going to be studying there 2 decades ago, or however long ago it was. And people are interested in that. So it's something that put it on the map. The fact as well that St. Andrews, like a number of other these ancient universities, doesn't have the same strenuous admissions that are solely based on academics that we see elsewhere in the UK. And St. Andrews was an early adopter of the Common App. Now, I have thoughts on whether or not you should use the Common App or not when applying to universities. And
I think I know your thoughts. You've vented about me before.
Yeah.
You're an advocate of not using it for a St. Andrews app.
I think if for no other reason than, it's $30 to apply to up to 5 programs on UCAS, and the UCAS application itself takes less than an hour once you've written your personal statement. I think some people spend that much time on some of their supplements for places like Glasgow and St. Andrews. There are times where it makes sense to use Common App and we'll probably talk about those here in a few minutes, but I think that also is a big key of it. Is St. Andrews is one of the earliest UK universities to be on the Common App. And again, I joke that typically when someone comes to talk to me, St. Andrews a third of the time is a place they mention, and only about a fifth of the time do they end up applying. But those students who love it, who find it to be a good fit, love it. And if you're the kind of student who wants to disappear off someplace next to the North Sea and study what you want to and be surrounded by these ancient cathedrals of learning, then you're going to love it. If you hate the idea of being surrounded by golf courses and sheep, with Edinburgh being an hour away, St. Andrews is not for you. But to each their own.
Well, I see why you call them ancient. I did a little prep in preparation today, so it wouldn't sound like a total ignoramus, and found it in 1413 for St. Andrews, and then Glasgow 1451, and Aberdeen 1495. Like, you know this because you went to College of William and Mary. 4 schools in this country that are founded in the 1600s, College of William and Mary being one of them. So like these schools have a 200 plus year head start on 250 in the case of St. Andrews on any of our schools. So maybe that ancient rumor you heard that we adopted our system partly from them and has some truth to it.
Well, that's again one of the crazy things. The 4 Scottish universities, other than Oxford and Cambridge, predate every other or every other English university, and it's something that back in the 1800s caused a bit of consternation because the universities were in Scotland other than Oxford and Cambridge, which led to this movement that saw UCL and other places being founded. So it's and for a brief period of time, America as a colony had more colleges and institutes of higher learning than England itself. And I'm just a little bit proud that William and Mary was one of those that tied it up for them.
So why don't you tell us who constitutes the ancient Scottish schools, and just give a kind of a little bit of an overview of each of the schools that would be in that grouping.
So by far the most famous is St. Andrews, and I think we've talked at length about it. But according to most of the international league tables, the most highly ranked of the 4 ancient universities is the University of Edinburgh. And Mark, I know I've went on before of how much I love Edinburgh because I think it's a great option for so many Americans because it's by some counts ranked 20th in the world. And of the 4, they are probably the biggest sticklers when it comes to admissions, but they're still they just want 3 AP scores of 4 or higher, which compared to other UK universities further up the list or further down it, depending on which way you're going to get to, the LSEs and the Oxfords and the Cambridges, that's attainable. That's something a lot of students who are looking at these universities can have by the end of their junior year, and therefore not have to deal with with a conditional acceptance.
So when you say they just want 3 scores of 4 or higher, like I know this because of somebody that you and I are both working with, literally told me of a school that doesn't even ask for a transcript until after someone's already admitted.
Right.
Are you saying that literally it's AP scores and what, SAT scores and not even a transcript review? Or where does the transcript review come into play?
So for a lot of them, the transcript's going to come in after the fact, just once you've been offered a conditional acceptance. So it's really just you're kind of honor bound at that point to tell the truth because there's not a lot of backing out once they've already accepted you. And if one other reason that I like the Scottish universities is they do have that bit of wiggle room for American students during, if say they miss the mark by 10 points or 20 points on their SAT, or they get 2 4s and a 3 and the 3 is not really relevant, but it was still laid out in their condition. Sometimes, and this is never a guarantee, but sometimes they're more willing to look past all of that. If it's a falsehood on the application, you can forget about it.
Sure. So let's stick with Edinburgh. So what type of SAT are they looking for? And do they equally value SAT and ACT, or is it like SAT territory? Or do they value them equally?
They're valued equally, and depending on the program, because engineering is going to have higher requirements. Thankfully, things like engineering and medicine are going to have higher requirements than history. And remember, I was a history major, so I feel I can, poke a little fun.
You can take your shots and get away with it without the tomatoes coming at your head.
But typically in the range of the high 1200s and low 1300s is what's typically required. So it's still a decent score, and that's what you're going to find across the 4 ancient universities is somewhere, I think Aberdeen may have the lowest at 1250. But Aberdeen also, for example, only wants, in some cases, 1 AP score. If you've got a high enough, and this is where things get interesting, is Edinburgh still cares mostly about the APs. The other 3, especially St. Andrews, are more willing to, if you want that more, I don't want to say holistic because extracurriculars and things like that don't matter as much. But if you want a decision more driven by your performance across 3.5 years of high school rather than just 20 hours of collective testing, you can do that. You still need to, in a lot of ways, be in the ballpark on the tests. Now, they are flirting with the idea of going test optional, especially Glasgow and Aberdeen, simply because the pandemic showed that was a failing. But even then, they still want to, you've got to have a pretty high GPA and pretty good extenuating circumstances. It's not quite that they're just going to accept that you want to go test optional. You've got to have some reason to back it up. It requires a couple of extra administrative steps. And again, the reason for that is mainly the pandemic. So I imagine for 2022, they're still saying they're going to do that. I don't think that's going to be the case much longer, simply because they like having the data. They like having the hard numbers. But what that does mean is we can start to see some places where your GPA matters more. And it's your unweighted GPA as opposed to your weighted GPA. And for some programs, it's as low as a 3.0.
Friends, this completes the first half. We hope you'll join us next week for the final part.
In our preview of episode 270, we will have announcements and then part 2 of Mark's interview with Dr. Martha Saunders, the president of the University of West Florida.
All right, friends. And, I'm going to close with this. Please, please, please keep financial fit in mind when you look at a school. Going to college is unlike anything else. You tend to get the bill after you're all emotionally hooked in. So you need to reverse that, and you need to figure out what's the maximum budget you can pay, how much you as a parent are going to pay, how much you expect your student to pay. Are they going to take out loans? Are they going to work during school? Are they going to work during the summer? What's the maximum amount you can afford, and stay within your budget. Financial fit matters. Make sure you look for financial fit. See you Monday, everybody.
Take care, my friends.
And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us, and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 14. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel, and to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. If you want to have a coaching session with Lisa or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcast. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Thursday.